Speaking of President Joe Biden, he delivered a speech, and much of the speech was spent taunting, or some of the speech was spent taunting former President Donald Trump on his economic record. It was funny to see, and I'll show you a couple clips from this, and then we'll discuss.
When it comes to reducing deficit, let's compare the records a little bit. Under my predecessor, you remember the self-professed king of debt? Well, it turned out he was. He's actually the emperor of debt. He created more debt than any other president did in 1 year. No, I'm serious. For starters, when he passed that $2 trillion tax cut, skewed to the wealthy and big corporations, they didn't pay for a penny of it. The end result was that it has ballooned the national debt by nearly 40%.
And then he goes on to talk about his far superior record when it comes to the debt and the deficit. Now, I do always want to be super accurate. Obviously, he's going to word it that way. It's true that Trump's tax cuts ballooned the deficit, and he didn't have a fiscally responsible approach to being president. A lot of the increase to the debt was necessary because of the recovery to the pandemic, so that I don't blame Trump for. Similar to some of the things we talk about with elements of Biden's presidency that are negative, that the pandemic actually are responsible for, and so we don't blame Biden for that. Same thing with Trump on the massive increase towards the end of his presidency to the deficit, thus debt. But that doesn't excuse a massive ballooning of the deficit for the purposes of giving massive tax cuts to those disproportionately at the top of our economic ladder. And that did happen under his watch. So breaking up, now he did mishandle the pandemic, so that made it worse. But just kind of put simply, pandemic recovery, I don't blame him for. And we would have seen an increase to the debt, absolutely. The massive tax cuts before that, I do blame him for, and we see this time and time again. We're going to be fiscally responsible unless we want to give big tax cuts to our wealthy friends, and that is the record of the GOP, whereas Biden has cut the deficit, whether you like it or not, all while overseeing massive implementations of historically impactful legislation. And then here is the next clip.
In fact, only 2 presidents in American history with fewer jobs the day they left office than when they started. One was President Hoover, and the other was Donald Hoover Trump. Seriously, only 2 presidents in American history. And look, you may remember my predecessor promised to be the greatest job president in history. Well, it didn't really work out that way. He lost 2 million jobs over the course of his presidency, 2 million. We've created 13.4 million new jobs. We not only recovered all the jobs we lost during the pandemic, we've added millions more. We've seen record lows in unemployment, particularly, and I've focused on this my whole career, particularly for African Americans and Hispanic workers and veterans.
And we've gone through those stats in the past. The notable part about this speech was kind of his new branding that he's using of Donald Hoover Trump because of the abysmal record of Herbert Hoover, and the fact that they're the 2 presidents that left office with fewer jobs than whenever they came into office. Now, as I always do go back to, and you just heard me do it previously, I don't think we need to ignore the context of COVID to explain the much stronger economic record of Joe Biden. And so, yes, it's the case that most likely if COVID hadn't happened, Trump wouldn't have been one of those presidents. He wouldn't have seen less jobs when he left than whenever he came into office. Now, it's important not to ignore his mishandling, but also say whoever was president would have dealt with an economic downturn. That's absolutely the case. Okay. But if you think Trump was strong, was great because of the economy, you saw him take a good, strong economy that was left by Obama. And we're putting this into very simple terms. The president isn't driving the entire car of the economy, but that's kind of how it's talked about politically often. So to use that terminology, Obama handed a strong, good economy with still lots of flaws, but again, putting it simply. And then Trump took some of those metrics and they just kind of kept heading in the direction they were heading before. We were on a trajectory. He didn't mess it up until the pandemic. Is that what you're going to say is stunning? So for example, take unemployment. Unemployment went from pretty low to historic low. Then Biden came in, it was high, and it went all the way down lower than it was under Trump. You're going to say that's not impressive on the part of Bidenomics? You think it's impressive for Trump to take pretty low to even lower, but not impressive to take it from high to even lower than that. Come on. And all these different metrics reflect that, except the one thing that still is higher than we want it to be is inflation. But as we talked about, that is an economic aftermath of the pandemic caused economic downturn and the recovery that was necessary from it. And I can say that for absolutely certain because of the reality that we're seeing it worldwide. In countries such as the G7 comparable economies, it's higher than it is in the United States, not to downplay the significance of the pain that it causes in people's lives here, but just to understand, okay, this is clearly larger than Joe Biden. So within the context of the authority he has, how has he done? Incredible. And that is a much stronger record, much more impressive than I didn't mess it up and we kept heading on the same trajectory we were on for a few years and then the pandemic happened and I mishandled that. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to be a part of what makes this show possible, plus get access to the full video version of the show and get a bonus show on the weekends, you can do so by going to lukebeasleyshow.com/membership. That's lukebeasleyshow.com/membership. And there's a link in the description.